In 1925, the fires of revolution swept the United Kingdom. The upstart syndicalists had brought the royalist government to its knees. The king and his family had hastily fled. What remained of the Royal Navy began a mass evacuation of nobles and loyalists. Ultimately, the British government announced its own withdrawal and deserted the country. Great Britain was lost. The Home Isles were now under the control of the syndicalist revolutionaries. Leaving Britain behind, the royal family, along with the remnants of the government and the nobility, evacuated to the Dominion of Canada. The Royal Navy transported tens of thousands of refugees across the North Atlantic. These ships were crowded and filled to capacity, and women and children had little to eat. This event was named the British Exodus. The refugees were mainly nobles, aristocrats, landowners, soldiers, and anti-socialists. Many notable figures were among them: various politicians, including the Prime Minister Austen Chamberlain, military officers, administrators, businessmen, and socialites. Thousands of Britons began to disembark on Canadian shores. Government figures documented the arrival of 500,000 British citizens. Elsewhere in the world, America, Germany, Ireland, and across the Anglosphere and Europe reported receiving their own British refugees. As for the Canadian government, Sir Mackenzie King, leader of the Liberal Party, was the current Prime Minister of Canada, having won the 1925 federal election. His response to the revolution had been slow thus far, having dragged his feet on ordering the mobilisation of the Canadian Army. He initially welcomed the royal family and their fellow British exiles, but was soon met with hostility from the arriving British government in exile. British Prime Minister Austen Chamberlain and his Conservative Party demanded an immediate invasion of Britain and full command over the Canadian Army. King George V, who had arrived before the mainlands collapsed, openly expressed his support for Chamberlain and the British Conservatives, telling Mackenzie directly, "We must make every effort possible to retake Britain." Mackenzie rejected the demands. Therefore, with backing from the King, Chamberlain ordered the Canadian Prime Minister and his administration to resign, and thus let the British government replace it. Chamberlain ascribed that it was in the Empire's best interests that His Majesty's government lead the Dominion. Mackenzie refused, and rejected any suggestion of British involvement in government. In the rest of the British Empire, there was confusion and unease. Scattered reports had filtered out to the colonies, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. When the news broke that London had fallen, gradually throughout the Empire, the dominions and colonies faced widespread panic and growing unrest. The colonial administrations turned inward, committed to ensuring their own survival. Without the support of the Royal Navy, the British could not reinforce or protect their expansive overseas empire. The British Raj, known as the jewel in the crown, already plagued by revolts, finally collapsed into a civil war between independence insurgents and loyalist forces. As Britain's inability to defend its colonies was laid bare, the German Empire ordered the seizure of British holdings in Eastern and Western Africa under the guise of maintaining order. The colonies would become a part of Germany's Middle Africa. In China, the government of Hong Kong voluntarily handed over the city to the Germans in exchange for protection. The remainder of Britain's concessions was seized by Japan and Germany, each trying to take as much as possible. Germany would also occupy the strategic colonies in Southeast Asia. Australia and New Zealand had already endured great upheaval. In 1923, a police strike in Australia devolved into a week of rioting that required military intervention. The press described the rioting as an outright uprising, referring to the rioters as the Melbourne Commune. In response, the government enacted emergency protocols. The following year, King George V passed the Consolidation of Resources Act, merging Australia and New Zealand into the Australasian Confederation. Future elections were suspended indefinitely. Following the fall of Britain, Australasia assumed command of the British Overseas Fleet. A secret deal would see Ireland reunified without British consent. The British government in exile would denounce the reunification and state that Ulster will remain British now and forever. In the Caribbean, the West Indies Federation was formed to secure a tighter grip over the British Caribbean possessions and prevent further revolt. The French exiles would eventually agree to transfer their portion of the West Indies to British control. In America, as they began to realise they had lost their largest trading partner, panic set in. The inevitable came to pass, and on April 20th, 1925, the American stock market crashed, signalling the beginning of the Great Depression. The British Empire, once the undisputed ruler of the world, was collapsing. The sun had begun to set on the empire and rise over the Kaiserreich. The British politician Winston Churchill would write, "The old world is dying. We will never see its splendour again." The Dominion of Canada quickly adopted the role of leader of the remnants of the empire. The arrival of the exiles caused a great upheaval in Canadian political life. The office of the Governor-General was abolished, with King George V assuming his role as King of Canada. Rideau Hall became the new royal residency of the monarchy. The Canadian and British armies were merged under mixed Anglo-Canadian leadership, although the navies remained separate. Canadian politics shifted to the right. The British Conservatives, dubbed the Exiles, had begun to influence and directly meddle in Canadian affairs. The senior British exiles became members of the King's new Privy Council and would advise the King and the Canadian Conservative Party on all matters. Following their advice, King George would appoint British politicians to the Canadian Senate, slowly stacking the Senate in British favour. By the 1930s, the British predominantly controlled the Senate. Throughout Canada, a Red Scare gripped the country. Prime Minister King implemented a strong anti-syndicalist policy, cracking down on the unions and socialists. The government stoked fears of a possible revolution in a concerted effort to vilify syndicalism and unite the country against the ideology. Some ministers even proposed adopting the blue ensign as the civil flag to distance themselves from the syndicalist red flag. King would continue to clash with the exiles and held a drastically different vision for Canada's future. Although he supported efforts to reconquer Britain, he would not commit to any proposals. He told his critics that the idea of conducting an amphibious invasion across the Atlantic was a thing of fantasy. He would say, "Until the logistics of such an operation are worked out, there can be no invasion." The following year, after a referendum, the Dominion of Newfoundland was incorporated as a province of Canada. Some sources would claim the vote was rigged by the British exiles. Gradually, Canada embraced its new role as the capital of the empire and home of the royal family. King George remained determined to reconquer the Home Isles, openly supporting the Tories and meddling in internal affairs. In public, he showed a stalwart devotion to his people by performing his royal duties and offering words of encouragement. In private, he was a broken man. His spirit had been shattered after losing the Great War, the loss of his youngest son, and finally the fall of Britain itself. He confided once, "I have lost my empire, my country, my home." The constant turmoil had taken a toll on the king's health. He long suffered from chronic bronchitis, exacerbated by his heavy smoking. As his health weakened, his eldest son and heir, Edward, the Prince of Wales, would take over many of his duties. Edward, known as David to his family, was the darling of Canadian media. He was handsome, confident, and unmarried. He was idolized by the press and adored by the public. Wherever he went, crowds gathered to cheer him and shake his hand. At the height of his popularity, he was the most photographed celebrity of his time, and he set men's fashion. Like many of his fellow exiles, he railed for retaking the home isles. In private, he was deemed a vengeful man and expressed a deep bitterness at the Canadian reluctance to fight. He once said, "It is cowardice not to fight. Every last syndicalist must be driven from Britain." In public, he would make speeches about his birthright, which he claimed was stolen from him. This inspired the Reclaim the Birthright propaganda campaign. Those 3 words would become the rallying cry of the royalist forces. His relationship with his father significantly deteriorated. The king was disappointed in Edward's failure to find a wife and appalled by his many affairs. The prince preferred married women. Despite his father's objections, he continued his relationships with a series of married women, one after another. His father would scold him. "You dress like a cad. You act like a cad. You are a cad." Edward carried on with his dalliances. In contrast, George was fond of his second son, Prince Albert. However, he was shy and socially awkward, and suffered from a powerful stammer.
I'm sure that we are all happy to feel that the generosity of His Majesty
Relations with the Prime Minister and the royal family were strained. The king had no time for the Liberal leader, causing the press to talk about the war between the kings of Canada. Mackenzie had struggled to deal with the Great Depression, and the exiles had succeeded in portraying him as ineffective in dealing with the Union of Britain. As the 1930 federal election started, Mackenzie's main opposition was the British-backed Canadian Conservative Party, led by Sir Richard Bennett. The Tories presented themselves as the party of imperial unity. Regardless, Bennett received a public endorsement from King George, blatantly meddling in political affairs, and sealed the election victory for Bennett. Despite leading a 100% Canadian cabinet, Prime Minister Bennett relied on guidance from the British exiles. Soon after taking the reins of government, Bennett proclaimed that the ultimate goal of Canada was the reconquest of the home isles. He recalled much of the British fleet from the Pacific and the entire South African station, causing great resentment from the Dominions. With the power of the Royal Navy at his disposal, he ordered the fleet to engage the Republican Navy in the Atlantic. Bennett had hoped to humiliate the upstart Republican Navy. He delivered a fiery speech. "Every man and woman must put the iron heel of ruthlessness against the threat of socialism and syndicalism." This address gained him the nickname Iron Heel Bennett. The Navy waged a popular but ultimately indecisive war of skirmishes against the syndicalist Navy in the Atlantic. Once the news broke that the Republican Navy had sunk the HMS Sioux, HMS Crescent and the HMS Algonquin, the government lost its support and ultimately collapsed in 1931, letting the Liberals back into power. Mackenzie King had once more consolidated Liberal power in Canada, as he feared that the country was being overwhelmed by the Tory exiles. He decreed that cabinet members had to be members from the lower house to nullify the British-dominated upper house. Some feared that Canada was becoming an authoritarian monarchy with the appearance of parliamentary democracy, like Germany. Other approaches came from the French-speaking inhabitants of Quebec, worried by the growing influence of the British. The French Canadians felt no allegiance to the British and had already refused to fight for them in the Great War. The Quebec inhabitants had made it clear they would oppose any conscription if it were to occur. By the mid-1930s, Prime Minister Mackenzie King recognised that another Great War was coming. With the instability in America and the rising tension in Europe, it was unavoidable. Despite many elements of the exiles wishing to also recapture Ireland, Mackenzie had embarked on a policy of reconciliation with the lost Dominion. In the event of war, Ireland could prove to be a vital launching point against the Union of Britain. Militarily, the Canadian Army in the Great War fought exceptionally well, stunning most nations with their combat effectiveness, succeeding where the British and French failed, capturing the German-held high ground of Vimy Ridge. Because of this battle, Canadian soldiers were now considered some of the most elite soldiers on the face of the earth. Even when the Great War was lost, the Canadian soldiers took pride in the fact that they were never defeated in the field. Now, since the Revolution, the British exiles and the Canadian Army were merged. In 1927, a reorganization of the army began to accommodate the influx of British officers from around the Empire. The army was brought back to full fighting strength by 1935, but manpower was a major issue. As for the Navy, because of the Revolution, overnight Canada became a major naval power. In 1928, the Royal Navy, under the guidance of Admiral Keyes, began an ambitious building program to bring the Royal Navy up to a modern fighting level. All the naval services were expanded and improved, with the emphasis being put on long-range ships. Canada now led the Entente, a revanchist alliance with the exiled French Republic and Britain's historical ally Portugal. In 1935, the Prince of Wales returned from a tour in the US. While in the country, the Prince had been spotted intimately with the Hollywood star Constance Bennett, the highest paid actress in Hollywood at the time, a married woman with 2 previous divorces. The ailing king expressed his disapproval and said of his son, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months." Over the next few months, the king's health worsened. This fact was kept from the public to keep up appearances. The king took to his bedroom at Rideau Hall. On January the 20th, 1936, at 11:55 p.m, King George V died. His last words reportedly being, "How is the Empire?" Upon his death, Edward ascended to the throne as Edward VIII. The country entered a period of mourning, and the state funeral for the former king took place. After months of preparation, in a public spectacle never before seen in Canada, the coronation took place. The streets were adorned with royal banners, and the largest crowds ever witnessed in Canada gathered to watch the king. A massive parade followed him to the cathedral. For the first time in history, the coronation of a British monarch did not take place in Westminster Abbey. The king was officially crowned, Edward VIII, King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions and Emperor of India. In his first radio address since being crowned, Edward spoke to the Empire about the future. The world established after the end of the Great War is now falling apart, and the Empire must be ready, We cannot put our heads in the ground and wish things were other than they are. For one way or another, the wars overseas will come to our shores. We must be ready. We must all do our part. We must reclaim our homeland. Join us next time for the United States of America.
There is a place in line for you. Subscribe. Happy holidays!